You're listening to Up an Octave, a podcast by Sonivia, the podcasting agency that believes that women and non-binary people deserve to take up space in the podcasting industry because our thoughts, voices, and stories matter. Here you'll learn how to make dope podcasts that inspire, educate, convert, and most importantly, make your voice shine. I'm your host, Rue Spence, and I'm here to take podcasting up an octave. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Up an Octave. Today, we are talking about branding your podcast. So whether you're just starting out or maybe you think it's time to revamp your show, you're gonna want to tune into this one. First off, let's talk about what a brand is. You may think of branding as golden arches, a swoosh, or mouse ears, but it is much more than that. It is the soul of your podcast. It's what your audience thinks about when they hear your show's name. What kind of images does your branding conjure up? To dive a little deeper into this, let's take Sonivia, and by extension, this podcast, for example. You'll see that I use a lot of neon themes. I like it bright and punchy with pinks and purples and blues. That is my brand identity. I want it to kind of feel like an 80s pinball arcade, like driving down the highway with the windows down on a summer night. I want it to be exciting and alluring. That's what my brand feels like to me. But that wasn't always the case. When I first started Sonivia, I leaned into a lot of like warm jewel tones, cozy kind of feelings with like a witchy vibe to it. And then I realized that I just wanted to have more fun. So I rolled out a slight rebrand where I updated things to make it feel more exhilarating, to make it feel like what working with me feels like. Now, when I first started Sonivia, I hadn't really even thought too much about branding. I had been freelancing for years, but I knew that I needed to get more serious. And with that, I needed to cultivate a brand identity. So I went with what made sense. Most days, I dress in like rich, dark jewel tones. I'm kind of witchy woo-woo, and I can tell you what phase the moon is in, and that you are being a total Gemini right now. That is the aesthetic that appeals to me, but it just felt subdued, and it didn't feel like what I try and bring to my clients. I don't want to bring subdued energy to the table, and I also didn't want to catfish people. I wanted to bring that really vibrant energy that I give my clients to my brand. And this is somewhere that it's important to realize that just because you like something doesn't mean that it makes sense for your brand. If you're like me, you might find that you struggle with actually knowing what you like. This is kind of like an identity crisis for me. If you've seen that meme that's like, I love your personality, thanks, I made it for you. I relate to that because I have a knack for knowing what objectively looks good. And because of that, I'll sometimes like create something that does look good. And then only later will I go, oh wait, I think I hate this. There's probably a deeper psychological thing at play here because to tell the truth, I honestly struggled with integrating the vibrant neons in my rebrand because they are big. And even though my house is plastered with Keith Haring and I aspire to dress as cool as 11 in season 3 of Stranger Things, it feels really bold to have those colors and that scheme be my day-to-day life. I've gone on that tangent to tell you that I have been in the trenches of branding. And also to tell you that it is always easier to brand other people because it is like naming a child. Branding for yourself is tough. That's why there are whole branding professionals. And if it's within reason for you, you should definitely seek one out. So let's rein it back in and talk about branding for your podcast. First up, your show's name and what that evokes. To do that, let's take a look at some other podcasts. I think Stuff Mom Never Told You is a great example because that show unpacks the things that we need to talk about but don't. And you kind of get that idea just from the name. It sounds like your big sister saying, hey, mom never told you this, but I'm going to. Another one is Date Yourself Instead, which to me immediately kind of conjures up like romanticizing your own life and making that feel delightful regardless of your partner status. And then also, I love Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness, and that name immediately tells me that curiosity is going to be what drives the conversations in these episodes. Your name is going to help listeners immediately identify the brand messaging of your show. I've talked about Up an Octave and how that name came into being, but I think that also is indicative of what you're going to hear with this show. I'm talking about podcasting, but I'm talking about it specifically at a different octave. Now, to go back to those 3 examples, if we take a look at the branding of these shows, we can visually identify even more things about them pretty much just at a glance. With Stuff Mom Never Told You, the cover art, which I love, is this dark brick wall with the title in neon. And I love this cover art because it gives like that edgy, exclusive feeling that helps you know that this podcast is going to say, "Psst, did you know this?" It feels like you turn down an alleyway and see this podcast waiting for you. Date Yourself Instead also has fabulous branding. The cover art is Liz in a fabulous dress, just positively glowing in front of the city skyline. And I also want to talk briefly, her old cover art was her enjoying just this like decadent bowl of pasta by herself. And both of those images just shout, I can have fun all by myself. Like, I don't need you. I can date myself instead. And then also with Getting Curious, we see Jonathan Van Ness with their finger on their chin, kind of like, pondering with like a chalkboard behind them and all these different doodles that suggest topics that might be covered on different episodes. So with cover art, the most important thing is to make it feel like you. If you love orange, put in an orange element. Give your show a spark of your you-ness to really up the authenticity factor. And so briefly to talk about the visuals, since I did bring up like if you love the color orange, I'm not a color theory expert, so I'm not going to go super deep here because I think Google is way more credentialed to do that. But think about what type of show you have and how colors can factor into that. If you do love a certain color, see if you can wiggle it in there somehow. Do remember though that colors can mean a lot of things. So say you're talking about spicy TikTok books. It might make sense to have some sultry red in there. You could also, if you do love orange, have it be, flames and have some orange flames in there. But to go back to that, sultry kind of romantic red could also be great for a true crime. If you're talking about nasty axe killings, it makes sense to have some red in there. That's kind of all I want to touch on with colors because like I said, you can find way more comprehensive color theory conversations that I am out of my depth, but just to start thinking about how color informs what your show is about. Next, let's talk about fonts. And I'm just going to go super basic. There are so many fonts out there that I love, but let's just take it back to Windows 98 to talk about this. If you are using the Chiller font and your podcast is about how empowering it is to be an entrepreneur, that might not evoke exactly what you're hoping for it to. On the other hand, if you're a true crime podcast and you're using Chiller, it might be a little played out and campy at this point, but I love a campy podcast moment. So if you're leaning into that, I think that's a lot of fun. If you're going to use Comic Sans, I hope at this day and age that you are a podcast about comics because, that font just kind of needs to be done. She has served us well and we need to lay her to rest and move on. But if you're doing a Let's Watch Marvel Movies podcast, something that feels like comic print could be a good fit. But Comic Sans definitely would not feel good for a veterinarian podcast. I'd be like, where did you go to school? And can you actually tell me how to take care of my dog? So consider the font that you're using, consider what it evokes, but the big caveat here is to also consider how legible it is. At one point, I was working with a client who was really, really invested in using this scripty kind of hand brushstroked looking cursive font. And it was a beautiful font and I loved it on her website. I thought it was beautiful. I thought it really evoked her brand, but it did not translate well to her podcast art because when you shrunk it down to that thumbnail that people see on their phone when they're just scrolling Apple or Spotify, you lost a lot of legibility and it just looked like really pretty swirls. So that is somewhere that I would consider, even if you're not going to use a super traditional or standard Times New Roman, make it something that is legible and easily readable when it is in that smaller format. This is somewhere that it makes sense to have at least a couple different brand fonts that you're using. So for me, I have really two primary ones on my current cover art. And even I will be the first to admit that my scripty kind of writing for Up an Octave itself can be a little bit difficult to see when it's super, super small. Since that is the title of the show, I don't really mind it for myself because I enjoy breaking rules and giving you examples of what not to do. But I also think that when you're seeing in like a sans serif, really legible font, as you're searching, you'll see the name of the podcast, that you can fudge that a little bit. But still, it's one of those things where if you can do better, you should do better. If you are going to use a scripty kind of font, do make it as big as possible. That can really help with making it more easy to decipher when it is smaller. Something else to consider is the imaging of your podcast cover art in general. So to take it back to getting curious with JVN's kind of like, finger tapping chin photo, you are kind of drawn in because A, they're a celebrity, so you probably recognize their face, but also it's the expression that they're making is captivating. It's, I am curious. I wonder what they're curious about. It kind of is a tell me more. It's like, what did this person find curious? Now, while we're on the topic of podcast cover art, I think it's also prudent to talk about episode cover art. You will see that some podcasts have specific art for every single episode. So when you click on each different episode, it has its own image. This can be well deployed if you have incredibly strong branding. So if I'm always going to see the same colors, the same fonts, the same like brand shoot images, that makes sense. If you want to have like your guest's image factoring into that for their episode's cover art, then that's awesome. But I strongly encourage it to be something that I still recognize as your brand. I think sometimes that having unique episode art can detract from your show because the branding messaging isn't strong enough. And I think it can contribute to pod fade because it's just one more thing that is on your to-do list. If you love making episode art, awesome. But personally, I advise against it unless you feel super passionate about it. Somewhere that I do think that having unique episode art can work is if you're doing like different seasons or different episode types. So if you have like a monthly minisode, it might make sense that every monthly minisode has the same unique cover art. So you have, your general podcast art, minisode episode art, and then, you pivot back to your normal art for other episodes. Something else to consider is your imagery. What type of imaging are you using? Like I mentioned, you see a lot of fun neon associated with my brand. I want it to feel punchy. There's a neon outline around me in my cover art. I want it to almost feel like we're in the tech space, like you got sucked into an old school video game. And because I'm talking about tech, I think it makes sense to have this kind of almost analog feel to my podcast branding. Now, if you're a true crime podcast, it probably wouldn't make sense to see like a lot of flowers. But if you're doing a true crime podcast that is crimes and murders that took place in Hawaii, it might make sense to have like hibiscus flowers be part of your imagery. And to really kind of break the rules well, you could do like an image of like a hibiscus flower that's dripping blood or, something like that would actually make sense with your brand. With imagery, this is somewhere that if I've said it once, I have said it 1,000 times. You don't need to have a microphone in your podcast art. We already know it's a podcast. Use that real estate more wisely. But wait, Rue, not only do you have script for your podcast cover art title, you also are holding a microphone. What gives? I know. But listen, I'm breaking one of my own cardinal rules here, but that is because my podcast is about people talking into microphones. That's how I get away with it. If this was a podcast about parenthood, it wouldn't make sense for me to be holding a microphone because you already know it's a podcast. If this podcast was about parenthood, it would make more sense for me to be holding a baby or holding a bottle or holding something else that's parenthood associated. Think about what you're trying to convey with your show, what you immediately want people to recognize, and let that be emblematic of what you're conveying in the art or imagery that is affiliated with your show. So for Up an Octave, I'm showing you that a microphone is going to be a huge part of the content for this show. I have entire episodes dedicated to microphones, so it makes sense that you see that. It wouldn't make a lot of sense if I was holding a chicken in my cover art. If I was a farming podcast, though, that would make perfect sense. So consider what you immediately want people to identify with your show. While I'm on my cover art soapbox, there are people who want to have a super long title. This kind of also goes back to your title. There are people who want to have a super long title with a subtitle and their name and their credentials. And I really encourage you to pump the brakes here. If you want to have a tagline, that's awesome. Make sure that it is big enough to stand on its own so it doesn't just get totally lost. Sometimes I see really long subtitles that are almost like a paragraph, and that's just too much. I think you can get away with a little bit of a longer subtitle if you have a shorter regular title. But too often I see people who have incredibly long titles and then feel the need to justify that long title with an even longer subtitle. Something else that I see is people who want to include their name and credentials or why they are qualified to be talking about what their podcast is about. My thing is that if people don't know you, if you don't have a recognizable name already, there's really no reason that you need that on the cover. You're already maybe going to have a picture of yourself, which I think is, gives it that human element already, that if you can just introduce yourself in the intro, you can save that real estate to deploy it more strategically. And also, it doesn't always translate super well. If you are a highly credentialed person, let's say you have 3 degrees, certifications, all that jazz, and you're super dope. I love this, and I'm not trying to take that away from you, but your cover art is not where you need to put that. So consider it like this. You have big title, awesome. Then you have your image. Maybe it's an image of you. Hopefully not you talking into a microphone. That's your art. Awesome. Then in your intro, you say, hey, I'm Dr. Susan James, a professor of this, credentialed in that, with experience here. This is my podcast, and I'm so glad you're here. That is how you deploy that. And it's going to be even more meaningful, especially when it's a credential that, if I'm just some kind of layperson who's only semi-interested or just getting into the world of your niche, I may not know what all those letters mean. To take it back to parenting, let's say that you have a parenting podcast and you are an international board certified lactation consultant or an IBCLC. I might not know what an IBCLC means if I am someone who's a new parent or who's not super familiar with the world of breastfeeding. I might not know what those letters mean. So if I see Dr. Susan James IBCLC, I know you have credentials, cool. I just don't know what they mean, and I don't know if they're going to make it so that you are someone who can help me. But if I see a podcast with a bold, easy-to-read title that's like Breastfeeding Success for New Moms or something like that, I go, okay, I know that I'm interested in getting some help with breastfeeding. I'm going to click on your podcast. And then in the intro, you say, hi, I'm Dr. Susan James, an internationally board-certified lactation consultant. And I go, oh my God, that's exactly who I want to talk to. I understand international board. That's a big deal. You're certified through them, and you're a lactation consultant, and that's exactly what I need. So that's more impactful to me than just seeing a string of letters. So use your intro as the place to really sell me on your expertise. Okay, enough cover art. Your brand is also how you're going to captivate people with your social media. For example, I use the same template that I have made for my reel covers on Instagram. I talked about Instagram a few episodes ago. If you haven't caught that one yet, make sure to go check it out. But I use a very similar style on all my reel covers. I have 2 specific fonts that I use to title what the reel is about, and then I overlay some kind of like a neon-y vibe picture. Shout out to Canva, we'll talk about them later. But that is what I do for every single reel, so all of my reels on Instagram have a very similar appearance. Whatever method you're using for marketing your show, having that consistency helps stop the scroll. When people see whatever they identify as being your brand as they're just doom scrolling or looking through social media, when they see that iconography that they associate with you, they will immediately know who it is and get curious and want to go listen to your new episode. The goal is not for people to go, I wonder who that is. That's how they will unfollow you. Occasionally, if you kind of need to break up the feed, that's fine. Like, for example, I recently posted a meme about the Super Bowl, but for the most part, I want people to see those neon colors, see that font, and know, oh, that's Rue, that's Sonivia. And, if you have an image that you really love, don't be afraid to just use that everywhere. So the photo of me, shout out Valeria Simon of Flourish Photography down in Columbia, South Carolina. She did my branding photos, and I am just so in love with them. But the image of me that you see on the cover of this podcast is everywhere. That is the photo on pretty much all of my profiles. It's my Instagram profile pic, it's my Gmail, Google. All of it is that photo of me. So that's somewhere that you also get to double down on your brand recognition. I definitely recommend getting a branding shoot done. With that, you see the cover art on this episode or on this podcast in general, because I don't do episode specific art. You see that art and you go, I think I like this girl. I'm going to follow her on Instagram. You get through typing about half of the word Sonivia and you're going to see the same picture of me and go, oh, there she is. I recognize that picture. So if you're able to really strengthen people's visual relation to you, that's also going to help. And that's not to say that for people to get to know you, it has to be a video podcast. Just seeing the photo of me in my cover photo and then that photo again on Instagram, you're going to start to recognize that's Rue. All right, this is where I'm going to make some designers probably roll their eyes, but this is where I love Canva. You can use that same image. You can, use it differently on your website, use it in your email signature. You can have it kind of all over to strengthen your branding. And these are all places that I have used that image and created something in Canva. I've created my email signature, which is that same picture. I've created elements of my website, which are that picture. I think that Canva is probably the most powerful tool for visual branding that is accessible because of its low entry point, both financially and tech-wise. Okay, so that was like a crash course in visual branding. Really quickly, I want to talk just a little bit about brand messaging. This is conveyed in your intro music and also in the way that you talk about your brand. So let's go back to this Hawaiian true crime podcast. If I hear a ukulele, most often I'm not going to think about true crime. I'm probably going to be like, man, I want to be sitting by the ocean with a cocktail in my hand right now. But if you have like a ukulele song that's in a minor key and it sounds kind of spooky, then you introduce, this is true crimes of the Big Island. It gives me that like cognitive dissonance feeling of like, oh, this is weird because I think it should be upbeat because it's ukulele. There's flowers, but the flowers are dripping blood and the ukulele sounds scary. It makes it extra eerie. It's kind of like when those horror movie trailers will do that like kids song, but they make it scary. They're like, ring around the rosy. And it's like something's reaching out from under the bed. And you're like, oh, it's freaky, even though it's like a happy kids song. So you can make that work in your favor if you're really going to cement that as your branding. So it's the exact same with that ukulele music. If you've got this like fun island breeze vibe, but then you find a way to alter it and lean into that scary branding, you can make that work for yourself. Consider your branding, consider what you want it to feel like. Close your eyes and think about like the music. How does it fit in with your visual branding? So you hear my show's intro and it's this bright, jazzy vibe that I can almost close my eyes and imagine walking down the street in some big city and you hear that music coming out of a theater somewhere. And you look up and there's this big neon marquee and it's like Up an Octave playing tonight, one night only. That's how my branding visually works for me in my imagination. So close your eyes and consider, what does your visual brand evoke auditorily? And is your intro music working with that or against it? Spend some time on Audio Jungle or Soundtrap, look through music, and some people have synesthesia. I don't think you have to have full-on synesthesia to have a visual component to your listening experience, to, have music remind you of something. So as you're thinking about the music for your show, consider, can I get to point B from point A? If you're using teal and yellow as your branding colors, what does that sound like to you? If you can start to think that way, you will help to connect the visual identity of your podcast with how your podcast actually sounds. And how your podcast sounds is actually super important for podcasting. Somewhere else that's not visual that you can really strengthen your brand identity is how your podcast sounds with the way that you approach your mic and the attitude that you bring to your show. So if one day you heard that I was coming to this podcast sounding like this and I was like, welcome to Up an Octave. Today we're talking about podcasting. You might think that I was playing an NPR interview, which how cool would it be if I got to be on NPR? I would love that so much because I am a total NPR nerd, but you would think like, wow, I guess maybe Rue's on NPR or maybe she's sad. That's really not the vibe I try and bring. So because I try and usually go like, welcome back to Up an Octave. Today we're talking about this. If I came and I was all, welcome back to Up an Octave. Today we're talking about branding your podcast. That wouldn't sound like me. Something else with how you address your podcast is to think about the tone. So I try and keep it a little more profesh on the podcast because even though your girl has the mouth of a sailor, I don't know if maybe you're planning your podcast around your kids, or you maybe want to play an episode for your colleagues if you're trying to encourage your place of employment to start a podcast. So I don't necessarily need to be dropping F-bombs left, right, and center. I try and keep it just a little more buttoned up so that you can listen to this show anywhere. But if I came on one day and I was like, what's up, MFers? Welcome to Up an Octave. You'd be like, whoa, Rue is really bringing some energy today. Consider how you approach the mic, how you talk, what you're saying, and the way you're presenting information. That's all part of your branding. I follow some really dope creators who their thing is like, we're making the best effing business we can. And I love that vibe. It's so fun to me. But because of the reasons that I listed, that's not how I approach my mic. It will turn some people off if you do that. It will also turn some people on if you do that. You can't please everyone, but it is something to consider that it all becomes part of your branding. If you are into that and you're like, we make the best effing podcast, that makes the F-bomb part of your brand. You might want to see that. You might want to have your podcast art have like a big title that says the best effing podcast with like asterisks. And that is magic right there. But it becomes your identity, and it's not my identity, so it's not my branding message. So that's why if one day you saw like, oh wow, this next episode is marked explicit, and Rue came in hot with, good morning, MFers, welcome back to Up an Octave, that would feel incongruent with my brand and my brand identity, and what you, as my listener, have come to expect. So just consider how you show up and what feels right for the audience you're curating. And that's not to say that you can't switch things up a little bit. You know, you want to be authentic. You want to bring how things are going for you in real life. You know, Whitney from the Impostrix podcast the other day messaged me and she's like, I feel like this move has taken forever. And oh my goodness, you and me both. This has been the longest move of my life. And it just keeps going and going and going and going. And I'm doing it with a teething toddler. But, you know, I try and leave a lot of that off mic. But I like that I can show up and be like, things are really thinging right now. But I try not to bring the heat too much and still keep this mostly informative. You know, you don't have to be a robot. You can bring what's happening in your life unless you're doing like a totally buttoned up storytelling podcast or something where you're not involved. Then that would make sense. But if you are having a really wild day, you are allowed to bring that authenticity as part of your branding. This is somewhere that you just, you know, you do the best with what you have. And, you know, I've gotten a little zany today with talking about like the Good Morning MFers. I get to have fun. I get to joke on this podcast because even though I try and curate this really serious, professional, valuable content, I also get to do it by having a little bit of fun. And that's where my neon branding, you're like, oh, okay, this girl can punch it up sometimes. But also because of how I typically present myself, you know that I do tend to be a little bit more serious, but I do it in a way that feels fun and feels electric. The last thing I want to talk about with branding is making sure that you are giving people a template that they can expect. You want your brand to feel cohesive. So just like TV shows, going back to Jonathan Van Ness, if you're watching Queer Eye, you know that part of it is going to be, you know, the person talking about who's been nominated, and then we meet the nominated person, and then we go into their home, and then we do each makeover, and then at the end, there's the reveal party, and the Fab Five reflects on it. End credits. It would be so weird if you were watching Queer Eye and JVN just wasn't there. You'd be like, okay, cool. We've still got the other 4 elements. We've still got the house makeover, the confidence coaching, but there's like no beauty element. That would be kind of weird because we've come to expect all of those elements. It wouldn't feel quite right. It would be like, you know, if you watched a home renovation show and you watch all 45 minutes of it and then there's no reveal at the end. It's like, okay, we did it. We made a nice house. Bye. So with your podcast, consider what people expect. Consider how you're going to deploy the information. Like for my show, you know that you're going to get the meat of the episode. You're going to get a little ad. Then you're going to get a listener question. Bada bing, bada boom, we're out of here. And part of why I do the listener question is because my branding is that I want to position myself as a person of service who helps my community. So if I didn't have a question one day, you'd be like, what's going on here? Or if I like completely changed my ad structure and all of a sudden I'm running an ad for a politician in the middle of my show, you'd be like, not quite what I expected. I kind of came here for podcasting. So anytime that you can create that branding that lets people know what to expect and you can double it down with consistency, that really does cement your brand from all sides. Psst. Hi, I'm interrupting the show to tell you about something special, a chance for us to connect one-on-one. Whether you're thinking about starting a podcast and aren't quite sure where to begin, or maybe you've got a show already, but you're not sure how to grow, I want to let you know about my free consultations. Yep, that's right. Absolutely free. No strings attached, no pressure, just a chance to chat with your fairy pod mother, that's me, about turning your podcast dreams into reality. You'll walk away from our conversation with actionable steps to take, whether or not we end up working together. Think of it as a gift to you and your show as a thank you for listening to the podcast. If listening to me here isn't enough and you're ready to take the next step, let's chat. Find the link to book in the show notes. Now back to the good stuff. We're going to wrap things up with our question, which today comes from Marci. Marci asks, where would you invest money if you are just starting out? I recently received a grant for my podcast, which is super exciting, but I'm feeling a little overwhelmed with spending this money wisely. There are so many things I'm considering, from equipment to my website. Where would you recommend I prioritize spending this grant? So first off, that is super exciting. And just a tip for anyone else listening that is trying to get started and is maybe doing like a nonprofit adjacent kind of thing or something very specific with your podcast, there is funding available if you know where to look. So Marci, for you specifically, first off, I recommend to everyone to doctor up their space a little bit, whether that's getting like the $30 isolation shield that I'm currently talking to in Olivia's bedroom, or whatever, kind of sound treatment is in the budget for you or makes sense for the space you're in. Because your mic only sounds as good as the room as it's in. If you are in like a big, echoey, hardwood-filled hallway, I would first spend some money on creating like a little bubble that makes you sound good. And that doesn't mean that you have to get the like ridiculously expensive acoustic tiles. You can get away with just the isolation shield that I use. That really helps a lot. And it's $30 on Amazon. I've even used like big heavy quilts or mattress toppers, like the eggshell foam mattress toppers, and I had super great results. I've seen people who will actually create an isolation shield out of those and like a big storage bin. That is very helpful, but if you have to buy that stuff, I think it's just cheaper and probably more effective to just get that isolation shield. So I would say first make sure that your space sounds good and then identify what microphone you need. You can check out my episode all about microphones to get some more ideas on that one. I think that there are some great options right at the $100 mark. I don't know how big your grant is, but I would suggest like starting there. You probably know, depending on what kind of podcast you're doing, if it's solo, you can just stick to the USB mic. If you're going to be doing in-person interviews, if it's like for a local organization, I would suggest doing the Rode Wireless Go microphones. Those are pretty user-friendly for people who are not traditionally podcasters. So that is where I would spend a big chunk of the money. Then I would get some headphones that are comfortable to sit under as you're recording and editing and doing all that. I am a huge fan of Audio-Technica. We've talked about them before. I would definitely invest in some good headphones. And then the other thing I would suggest is it sounds like Spotify for podcasters has been doing some really wonky changes. And at this point, I'm not sure if I'm super thrilled about suggesting them as a platform. So I am totally a Buzzsprout girly. I think that they have a great user interface, great customer service, and just a great product. So those would be the first places that I would spend money. And if you can afford it, bring on a branding consultant or hire someone to help you with everything that we've been talking about today. If not, I hope this episode's been helpful and maybe suggest a Canva membership or a subscription. But yeah, so my biggest suggestion is treat the room you're in, get a decent microphone, comfortable headphones, and then everything else is kind of second to all that. That's super exciting about the podcast, and I hope to hear more as it develops. I'm excited to hear what you choose to invest in. All right, that is it for today. Next week, I will be back to talk about whether or not you need to do video for your podcast and all the pluses and minuses that come along with that. In the meantime, please share this episode with a friend who is in the midst of branding their podcast or considering a rebrand. And while you're at it, if you could please take a moment to leave me a rating or a review on whatever podcatcher you're listening to this episode on, Because just like your show, mine needs those to grow. The party keeps on trucking over on Instagram, where you can see all of my neon branding at Sonivia Studios. So head on over there and let's hang out. Thank you so much for helping me take podcasting up an octave.